In 1972, the Volkswagen Beetle became the best-selling car in history, overtaking the Ford Model T after more than 15 million units sold. For a company born inside a Nazi war economy, built on forced labor, and later left abandoned by every major automaker on Earth, that number is almost impossible to explain. How does a company with the darkest possible origin story become one of the most beloved brands in the world? That question has an answer, and it is not simple. 3 things this story will force you to reckon with. First, did Volkswagen's founding engineer steal the design that made the company famous? Second, how did a factory built on forced labor survive the complete collapse of the regime that created it? And third, after Volkswagen spent 50 years building a reputation as the honest car company, what exactly made them throw it away? We will answer all 3. The story begins not with a car, but with an idea that belonged to several people at once. In the early 1930s, Germany was emerging from economic devastation. Millions were unemployed. Automobiles were still a luxury. And the new political leadership wanted a people's car, something affordable, reliable, and built for the masses. Ferdinand Porsche was given the contract. He was a brilliant Czech-born engineer with decades of experience designing high-performance vehicles. And over the following years, he developed what would become the Volkswagen Beetle, a compact, rear-engined, air-cooled vehicle with a distinctive curved body. But here is the detail worth pinning. Keep it in mind, we will come back to it. In 1931, a Hungarian Jewish automotive journalist named Jozsef Ganz had already designed a car called the Standard Superior, featuring a tubular chassis, a rear-mounted engine, and independent suspension with swing axles. The same features that would appear in Porsche's final design. The Standard Superior was even marketed as the German people's car, years before Volkswagen existed. Then there was the Tatra company in Czechoslovakia. Their Type 97 shared so many structural similarities with the Beetle that Tatra threatened legal action. Porsche himself later admitted, "Sometimes I looked over his shoulder, and sometimes he looked over mine." The legal dispute was resolved by force. German tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia. Tatra was ordered to stop producing the competing model. The lawsuit was dropped. And Jozsef Ganz, arrested, imprisoned, stripped of his professional standing. His contribution effectively erased. The Beetle was not one man's invention. It was the collective output of multiple engineers, some of whom paid a severe price for that contribution. That structural fragility at the origin of the brand would cast a long shadow. But the design controversy was only the beginning. What happened inside the factory was far darker. And the pattern it established, the pattern of silencing inconvenient voices, would resurface in a different form. 70 years later, by 1940, the Volkswagen plant had been converted entirely into a war factory. Civilian production stopped. Military vehicles rolled off the assembly lines by the thousands. And to staff the factory, Volkswagen conscripted forced laborers, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilian workers, Jewish prisoners transferred from concentration camps. By the peak of the war, more than 80% of the Volkswagen workforce was composed of people who had no choice but to be there. They were underfed, poorly housed, working under conditions designed to extract maximum output at minimum cost to human life. The governance failure here was not merely institutional, it was foundational. Think of it this way. In any organization, the incentive structure determines what information travels upward. When the system rewards compliance and punishes dissent, the people at the top receive a filtered version of reality. They see what the structure wants them to see. At Volkswagen in 1940, that structure was total. No channel for dissent existed. No stakeholder could push back. And so the consequences became invisible to those with the power to stop them. One documented example makes this concrete. The factory established what it called a nursery facility, ostensibly for pregnant forced laborers to give birth and receive postnatal care. In practice, infants were neglected, left without adequate food, medical attention, or warmth. A nurse named Hilda Lammer raised formal objections. She was threatened with deportation to a concentration camp. Her objections were recorded and ignored. Historical estimates suggest that no fewer than 365 infants and toddlers perished at that facility. This is the documented record. When the war ended, the Allied forces surveyed what remained. The verdict was clear. Volkswagen should be dismantled. The factory handed over. The brand dissolved. What happened instead was one of the most counterintuitive corporate recoveries in history. It started with one British officer, a half-buried prototype, and a decision that every expert in the room would have called wrong. In 1945, a 28-year-old British officer named Ivan Hurst was assigned to assess the Wolfsburg factory and prepare it for demolition. Instead, he found a prototype Beetle under the rubble. He recognized that the production machinery, though damaged, was not beyond repair. He saw a city of desperate workers who needed employment and affordable transportation. And he made a decision that contradicted every professional opinion around him. Rebuild it. Nobody agreed. British manufacturers reviewed the car and declined, calling it technically unimpressive and commercially unviable. The French passed. The Australians passed. And then in 1948, the British offered the entire factory to Ford. Free of charge, Henry Ford II himself traveled to Wolfsburg. His executive vice president, Ernest Breech, assessed the factory and delivered his verdict plainly. What we're being offered here ain't worth a damn. Ford walked away. This is worth pausing on, because it reveals something important about how market miscalculation operates at the highest level. Every sophisticated industry player, reviewing the same evidence, reached the same conclusion. They evaluated the car against the standards of the market they already understood. And they were all wrong. The post-war world was about to need exactly what the Beetle offered. Compact, reliable, affordable, and for a younger generation in Europe and America growing exhausted by excess, symbolically resonant. A German engineer named Heinrich Nordhoff was eventually handed control of the plant. He simplified production, focused entirely on the Beetle, and began exporting aggressively. By 1972, the car nobody wanted had outsold every automobile in history. But Nordhoff's greatest achievement, the reputation for honesty, for simplicity, for being exactly what it claimed to be. That is what makes the next chapter so difficult to understand. Volkswagen spent the following decades building something more valuable than market share. They built a reputation, the honest car company, the brand that used humor to admit its own limitations, the company that did not overpromise. For 50 years, that reputation was the product, as much as any vehicle on the assembly line. Which is why the 2015 emissions scandal is not just a corporate story. It is a governance story. For years, Volkswagen had marketed its diesel vehicles as clean, fuel-efficient, and fully compliant with environmental standards. In reality, the vehicles had been fitted with software designed to detect when emissions were being tested and to reduce pollution output during the test only. Under real driving conditions, exhaust emissions were more than 40 times the permitted level. The deception had been in place since approximately 2009. It ran for 6 years before external investigators uncovered it. 6 years. That is the detail that demands explanation, because at an organization the size of Volkswagen, with engineers, compliance teams, regulators, and suppliers, the truth existed somewhere. Multiple people knew. And for 6 years, that knowledge did not travel to the people with the power and the obligation to act on it. That is not a technical failure. That is a cultural one, an incentive structure that made delivering bad news professionally dangerous. A measurement system that rewarded the appearance of compliance over compliance itself. A governance architecture in which the inconvenient truth had nowhere to go. Asian business leaders will recognize this pattern because it is not unique to Germany. Korean chaebol governance structures have faced similar critiques. Performance metrics that incentivize reported success while making internal dissent structurally risky. Chinese state-linked enterprises have encountered the same dynamic, where the cost of surfacing bad news exceeds the cost of concealing it, until the concealment itself becomes the crisis. The mechanism is identical. Only the industry, the decade, and the currency of the scandal change. The scandal cost Volkswagen approximately $30 billion in fines and settlements. By 2016, after years of recovery work, the company had overtaken Toyota to become the largest automobile manufacturer in the world. Under its umbrella sat some of the most coveted names in automotive history, brands that Volkswagen, the unwanted factory, had earned the right to own. The comeback, again, was real. But the Volkswagen story, across 80 years, 2 collapses, and 1 extraordinary recovery, is not ultimately a story about cars. It is a story about 3 things that matter in any enterprise, in any century, in any market. The first is governance, the structures that determine who can speak, who will be heard, and what information reaches the people making decisions. When those structures fail, whether in 1940 or 2015, the cost is always paid by someone, and it is rarely the people who design the structure. The second is trust. It takes decades to build. It can be lost in a single software file, a single decision made under pressure that chose the number over the truth. And the third is adaptability. Ivan Hurst saw value where every expert saw waste. Heinrich Nordhoff simplified when others would have diversified. The car that nobody wanted became the car that changed an era. For any leader watching this, the lesson is not to celebrate resilience after the fact. The lesson is to build the systems, the culture, and the governance mechanisms that make the next crisis unnecessary. That is the work. And it starts before the problem arrives.